What is a proportion? Well, a proportion is two equivalent ratios. So here we have two ratios, and they're equal. And in a proportion, the product of the means equals the product of the extremes. Well, what does that mean? What are the means and extremes? Well, we actually have names given to parts of a proportion. These two terms right here are called the extremes, and these two are called the means. And when you multiply the extremes, so if you multiply 3 times 8, you get 24, should equal, when you get the product of the means, when you multiply 4 times 6, it's also 24. And since the product of the extremes equals the product of the means, that means that this is in fact a proportion. So let's take a look. We just did this one, but I'll do it again. So if we multiply, this is your extremes and these are your means. So 4 times 6 is 24, and 8 times 3 is 24. So yes, that is a proportion. In this other example, if we do the extremes, 10 times 3 is 30, and I take the product of the means, 4 times 6 is 24, they're not equal. That is not a proportion. Those are not equal ratios. That does not form a proportion. So again, let's circle the extremes in this example. What would be the extremes? 6 and 4 are your extremes. And what would be the means? This would be your means. So how can you tell if two ratios form a proportion? Well, we looked at one method using cross products, multiplying the means and extremes. And again, 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12. That is not a proportion. Those are not equal. In this example, 4 times 9 is 36. 3 times 12 is 36. Those are equal. They form a proportion. So that's one way of telling whether or not two ratios form a proportion. Another way you can do it, if they're equivalent fractions, then they form a proportion. And sometimes this is a lot easier. So 3 times what is 6? 3 times 2 is 6. 4 times 2 is 8. That is not a proportion. Those are not equal ratios or equal fractions. In this next example, 3 times what is 18? 3 times 6. 4 times 6 is 24. So yes, these do form a proportion. And if you did the means and extremes, 4 times 18 is 72. 3 times 24 is 72. In this example, 4 times 6 is 24. And 3 times 12 is 36. So both methods will work to determine whether or not two ratios form a proportion. All right, let's finish up this video by just looking at these three examples and see if they form a proportion or not. And you can do it either way you want. You could do equivalent fractions. So 2 times 3 is 6. Is 3 times 3 9? Yes, it is. So that is a proportion. And I could have multiplied 3 times 6 is 18 and 2 times 9 is 18. Either way. In the next one, are these two ratios, do they form a proportion? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to look at equivalent fractions. 4 times 5 is 20. Is 5 times 5 30? No. This does not form a proportion. And if you were to multiply the means and extremes, you would get 100 and 120. So again, that verifies that is not a proportion. Now here's a perfect example. It's a lot easier to do equivalent fractions sometimes than it is to cross multiply. You could do 7 times 21 and 3 times 49, but really the easiest way to determine whether or not this forms a proportion is to look at it as equivalent fractions. So 3 times what is 21? 3 times 7 is 21. Is 7 times 7 49? Yes, it is. So that forms a proportion. So that's what a proportion is and how you determine whether or not two ratios form a proportion.